Welcome to the Funnel Reboot Podcast with your host, Glenn Schmeltzley. Let's get into today's show.
Hey, Glenn here. Welcome back to Funnel Reboot. Whether it's your first time listening or you are a repeat visitor, I'm really glad you're here because we're going to talk about visualization of data. Let's get straight into today's show. If your job involves numbers, you likely spend time graphically plotting them. Whether it's for analyzing or presenting, we usually toss these data sets into our visualization tool. That's mainly because it takes one button click or maybe 0 button clicks to get there, and we just start visualizing it. The problem here is that we're making content before knowing our intent. We're making the software master us instead of being its master. And today's guest says the visualizations that come from doing this won't be intelligible, won't make your audience motivated to act, and won't yield good decisions. However, he does passionately believe that when people who know how to read numbers see it presented the right way, it'll motivate them to make the right decisions. Today's guest graduated from Cornell University with a BS and an MS in electrical engineering. In 2012, he founded a consultancy to help data leaders create armies of trustworthy decision makers. And he's been working in the analytics and data visualization field for 20 years now. He's associated with the data science programs at both NYU and the University of Chicago. And when he's not talking about visualization, he likes experiencing concerts from the front row and also hanging out with his wife and kids. Let's go now to New Jersey, where we're going to visit with Lee Feinberg. Lee Feinberg, welcome to the Funnel Reboot Show.
Great to be here.
Thank you. Today, our topic is going to be how we can communicate ideas, and there's a specific niche within communication that we're really going to spend our time talking about, and that is how we are doing it with the type of performance or maybe insights into how our businesses work. And we have a whole host of tools that are out there now, tools that assist us with crunching information, tools that visualize that information, tools that present that information. And I think we're so tooled up that we might even tune people out because we get so obsessed with the tools. So we need a little bit of help here, Lee. Is there anything you can tell us about what's wrong with just galloping into using all and any of the tools that we can think of to try to communicate our idea?
You hit one of the key things that I talk about with my clients and when I'm running my workshops, which is stay out of your software as long as possible. And there's many, many reasons that we go through of why that is and how staying out of the software actually you can speed up your work, which sounds almost opposite of how most people think, because it's, well, the tools are there and they're easy to use and I drag and drop and voila, I have whatever. And it actually causes a lot more problems that people have to deal with. So I hope we can get into talking about those issues a little bit more today.
Oh, we will. But first, I suppose I have to unlearn some of the things that those tools do to me, or at least be cognizant of them. So one of the things that I find myself doing when I'm using, let's say, we can even start with a spreadsheet. And I'm in the spreadsheet and I've got the data in front of me, right? That's where I have to get rooted in what I might be trying to look at and maybe show. But I look at all the menu items and they tantalize me. things like make a graph, make a pivot table, um, find interesting insights. Let AI tell you about these. And I don't have I'm not going into this with a framework. I'm just sitting there looking at rows and columns. So it would seem that the software wants to help me get to a point where I can share what's happening and maybe get somebody to take action on it. If I threw that scenario at you, what are the things about that I should also be thinking about instead of just letting the navigation menu tell me what to do?
In that situation, you have to divide up the work, because what you described almost was, I'm just starting out. I might have a set of data and I want to understand something about it. I might not be familiar with it at all. And maybe it's the first time, right? Or right, I just want to go through it, see what the scope of it is, etc. I don't even have any ideas necessarily, right? That's kind of one scenario, right? Where you almost just want to play around. And the software in that case is really good, because rather than working in spreadsheet mode, where you're just looking at rows and columns of numbers, it's very hard to see any kinds of patterns for most people. There are some humans who can do it, but I'm certainly not one of them. And that's where the idea of using visuals comes in, because we're all equipped with this natural ability to recognize different kinds of patterns. And some of them you have to learn, right? But generally, people know how to interpret a line chart or a bar chart, things like that, and some more sophisticated ones. And then there's really advanced charts that you have to learn what they mean. You can't just throw it in front of somebody and say, here it is, and expect that they're going to know how to interpret what's on it. And you see a lot of that today, because people get hung up on the shiny object, right? The latest cool thing, and they want to use it. And maybe they understand it because they played around with it, but they show it to someone else who's seen it and they have no idea how to use it. It may be completely inappropriate for their needs. So that's one situation, right? You're just kind of in a sandbox. You're trying to understand. That's great. When you move on to really trying to take that to more of the operational stage, right? Whether that's presenting a finding that you've already got, going through that process, or you might be creating a set of work that is going to be used by certain teams or management to work on operating the business. You have to take a different approach, because you're not just trying to play around anymore. You're really doing it to get an idea across to them
Yes.
about that information.
And an idea where you may have more context than they do.
Absolutely. So there's a real issue, and I don't necessarily have the answer. In fact, I don't have the answer to this, but I have some ways of addressing it. Is that most people, and picture, when I say people, it's your audience, your readers of the information, right, that's being produced, are not analysts. Right? Being an analyst is a profession that you have to really develop certain skills at. So they're mostly not analysts, and they are not necessarily analytical, which is different. They may just not be wired to think that way, to think as kind of a detective, to put the pieces together. And so those are real challenges for someone like myself, who might be creating something for them to read, is to really think about, how are they going to be able to use it? And of course, there's ways to kind of test those ideas as well, right? Just not make something and throw it out there and hope for the best. When you start to really do this on the job, right, you want to go out to your audience and find out if they can understand it before you just press the button and send it around. That's a different story. But even then, you want to think about, when you're in that stage, when you're in the writing stage, how does this get the idea across, and does it get the idea across in a way that doesn't require this heavy analytical lifting that I might be comfortable with as the author, but that my reader is not capable of. And there's a challenge there as well, because you also don't want to have it boil down to, say, the least common factor, right? So you simplify it so much because you're thinking, well, nobody's going to be able to use it unless I do it this way, where it doesn't become that useful anymore. So there's a real balancing act that has to go on, and this is the whole issue with organizations talking about things like data literacy, right? Which has a lot of different meanings to it, but the idea is, how do we get people to be literate in different ways around data, right? So it's the same thing as being literate with a language. Now you have to apply it to data. So not not necessarily a new concept, just application of it in a different way.
Sure. But we're in a world where information is, propagating at never seen before levels. So just to recap what I heard you say, you're talking kind of about skills there. And you were saying that very few of us are gifted at looking at many sets of just large numbers, that um, we certainly shouldn't suppose, even if we're an analytical type who gets that a person who we might be giving this information to also thinks that way. And you also said that people don't necessarily have that, it's my word, not yours, but that sense of causality where they, if we've ever taken a statistics course, we've started to see how you have to use math to understand if one set of numbers argues in a probabilistic way that something led to something else. So we have this information that, these are constraints that our poor old, evolutionary brains struggle with. But if I turn to the other thing you said is, I think something that we can go down to lowest common denominator and find in everyone is a craving to make sense of our world. And so
Mhm.
we can at least assume that we have it, and that the person who's going to be receiving information that we're going to share with them has it. Is this where we can start to suppose? You talked about writing. Is this where we can suppose that taking them along through a story is a good way to get and retain their interest as they try to make sense of this pretty involved information?
I think in certain circumstances, it definitely is going to help, because the notion and and the idea of data storytelling is another one of these terms that has been thrown around a lot. And it, again, means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But I think if you back up and just think about what the purpose is, I think this is where you're kind of going with it. It becomes a way to encapsulate the whole of what you're trying to do, versus, I'm going to make a chart
Yeah,
and another chart and another chart, and then I'll jam them together
right.
on a page.
Our quarterly presentation to management contains 3 slides for our division. I must fill them. Period.
Well,
We have to go through slide 1 in the deck, then slide 2 in the deck, then slide 3 in the deck, then I sit down. That does not necessarily do justice to our real objective.
yeah, absolutely. The and in some of those circumstances, those companies are just changing the numbers and showing the same thing every time, right? It's not even getting to anything. So the idea of the story brings you back to think about what is the point, right? And this is I think you already said the word communication, right? I'm trying to get an idea across, and everything has to always tie back to that idea. Now, the problem, again, with the storytelling, is someone might just say we should tell data stories. Yeah, some executive says we should do data storytelling, and people have no idea how to do that, or they think that they may use a piece of the software, a feature in the software that has the word stories in it. So they think they're telling a story, but they're not. They're just using a feature. So it's loaded with all kinds of problems that I think are frustrating for people and can actually make things worse because people try to do it and there's no definition or structure around what the organization really means about that. But I think your point about the story of can it be more engaging? I think when you do wrap it through with a theme, it helps people because they understand where it's kind of where it's supposed to be going, right? They can follow along versus kind of chart after chart after chart when there's not necessarily a connection drawn between them, or someone thinks that the audience should be able to make the connection, and that's where the challenge is again of how do you do that. And so by moving away from the data and the charts and thinking about the storyline first and then filling in the blanks.
Okay. If we're thinking about someone who's working in a context of describing marketing or sales, something related to acquiring and keeping customers, is the theme that we can use something like, here's what we collectively are trying to do. Here are what some historical results have shown, and here's where we're not doing it. Here's where it's not functioning as we'd hoped. And here's how the information on how it's not working might provide clues to tell us how we could get it to work. Is that an example? Or go ahead and give one of your own.
Yeah, I mean, and what you said makes great sense, but that's not easy for people to do necessarily.
Not without a framework.
Not without not even just a framework, as just also a thought process, and an organization just understanding of doing work that way. So the and I want to go back to this point about you brought up too about stories, because I didn't kind of finish that there's different kinds of stories that people can tell, because there's things like infographics can be a story, a visual story, right? We're talking about visual stories, of course, right? That's a type of visual story. Then there's the story of, which is more like what you said. Oh, maybe I found an insight about the business. I'm trying to make a specific point about the business. And I want to come in and I want to lead you through a story. I want to tell you about the past. I want to tell you about the future, maybe, and kind of where we are, right? You're weaving a story that way. The story that I tend to work on most with people, because they're still, frankly, at the starting point of this, is a story about what's happening in the business today. It's just the blocking and tackling of understanding what's going on first before you can even get to the, and then it may lead to some insights. But today it's just creating dashboards and charts, and there's no structure, not technical structure, but again, like you said, a framework. There's no framework for how do I put that story together, or even understanding what story should we be telling. Because what happens is, right, this is the scenario mostly in business goes something like this, where I might be an analyst and maybe I work with the marketing team and they come in and they give me a list of things to do and get me this data. Maybe they list some questions they want to answer. It's kind of a hodgepodge, right? And it may not, none of that may be connected in any way. It just may be the stuff that's on that person's mind. And so the person now who's the author, the analyst, just kind of does what they ask for.
Yeah.
And there's no understanding of why that person even came in the first place and asked them to do it. That person may not even really have formed the idea, potentially. They may have a kernel of it, or they might just be hoping to see something in the data, which is a bad strategy. Hope is a bad strategy.
Yeah. So I think the thing that you're highlighting, which I think we should see for what it is, not something that's completely bad, but something that is all around us that we've got to first recognize before we can move away to more the way you're describing. But I'm looking at all those things that you described, the dashboards, et cetera. That's operational data. That's are we doing? How are we doing? But it's not really just how it's a different type of information from the information that gets really interesting, like how should we be doing? So when I'm seeing just all the metrics, a litany of metrics that are basically the entire set of things that we could be tracking, I'm hearing you say, stop just giving those to management or other stakeholders. Yeah, they could go and check that. We have all the tools now. You can go and check that stuff every day. And sure enough, the sun came up today and we have yesterday's numbers. You're saying instead, take away a good chunk of that stuff. Now try to distill to the things that will really describe and that will provide some possible clues on how we can change for future. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, and I think the idea of the future, how I rephrase that is, what are the decisions and actions that we're ultimately trying to make? And that's really the point of all of this. And that's right. The data will help us there, but understanding, again, this ties back to the communication. It ties back to really the core of the business strategy, right? Why are we doing this? Why do you need it? How is it going to help you in what you're trying to do? And if you don't understand where someone is going with this, right, down that path to how they're going to put it into action, how can I give them a good starting point, right? So it goes from the operational side of it, which people still struggle with, right? Just figuring that out. But that's just even a kind of a launching pad to do an analysis,
Yeah.
right? And then
Yes.
the analysis starts to get at the why, right? Why did we observe this? What was the potential cause of it, right?
Yeah. Would you
And
agree
then
that we get suckered in though? And I guess software is partly to blame because when that when those metrics are sitting around, we kind of imagine that they all have something important to tell us. Um, but the way that you're describing how you should, you know, be questioning and be intentional of what you're going to go and get and how you're going to use information to determine those decisions. Would you agree that, this is about as silly as thinking, well, I've got to, if there's a public library near me, I've got to go to the public library to go to the reference section, and I've just got to look at all the pages inside of all of those reference books because somebody printed it and it's got to be helpful, doesn't it? Versus doing what we should do, which is searching the catalog based on what answer we want to get, and then just going perhaps to the one or two books in the specific section that will then help us. But we get this kind of sunk cost fallacy going, I think, but all that other information has to be useful, doesn't it? I'm hearing you say, no, it doesn't.
and that's why you don't care about the data. And I say that meaning, of course, you want to have good data and all the things that go into that are important for an organization, right? If you don't have good data, you'll never get a good output from it. So, but it's the idea that once you have that good data, that's where it stops, right? It's kind of like that does become, in your analogy, my reference section. Say, I know I can get the data. Great. I don't have to worry about that. But I'm not going to let that drive my activity. And that gets into, right, this word data driven. Well, it's like, right, it's a good term, but it's what does that really mean? Data driven. It's like it's not data first. It's yes, you of course want to use data
Right.
in how you run the business, but it's not the thing that you start with. So this, kind of getting back to this idea of, storytelling, and that there's different types of stories at different stages. What I think organizations have to understand, because it just becomes this bucket of a term, and there's different ways of doing it at different times. So I'll give you, let me see if this example might help, or like one of the things I've been doing is working with the University of Chicago, and they have a, a master's program. It's called a master's in applied data science, and they have a capstone project, and that project is with external clients, and they really try to solve a problem for them. And then the students have to give a presentation in the end about everything that they did. But it tends to focus all on the data. We got the data. This is what we did to the data. We ran these algorithms on the data. That's a majority of it. When in fact, that story is not about the data. The story is about how is it going to help the client and what's the impact.
Right.
And all the things you did are more to back up that what you're proposing is legit, right? But it's not the core of what you need to talk about. and that and that's common in the world, right? Again, it's that focus, and they're working really hard with the students to change that, right? Because they recognize that when those students are out in the real world, what they want to do is not focus on that, but focus on the what's in it for the client, what's in it for the customer, for the business. That's what's important in the story. And how do you tell that story about how we got the data might be important. There might be some wrinkles in that. Maybe there were some problems along the way. So we try to get them to tell it like a story, like you were saying before. That's much more, it's got some, um, it's not emotional. That's a strong thing, but some people say you should have, emotion is a good thing in stories, but it's pretty hard to get emotion going around data unless you lose a ton of money. That gets people really emotional about
Right.
data. But
Right.
uh, so those are the kinds of, that's one kind of story, and
Yeah.
and and that's very different than the story about what's happening in the business.
Yeah. It's
Yet the same person might be responsible for knowing how to create both of those kinds of stories.
sure. Yeah. We've got to be careful. I think the reflexive thing is just to give a journal of activities instead of thinking the recipient has certain decisions they must make. How do I give the most prominence to the things that were found out in the course of doing all of that work? Not to tell them the steps of the work. They probably, I mean, it has a time and a place, maybe in an appendix, but it's not what they came for.
Correct. And again, it just communication. It
Yeah.
it just goes back to that one word.
Yeah. I want to get more into how we then move over into visualizing and other ways of sharing this information. But before we do that, we're going to take a really quick break. Do you have a lot of company data in reach, but struggle to get useful business insights out of it? Do you open up your Google Analytics but find you're at a loss on how to get it reporting the way you want? Do you wonder what new marketing strategies you could leverage if you could just unlock what's in your data? If you said yes, then you sound just like other clients did when they started working with me. Many B2B companies who I've done project work with have been helped by modernizing their analytics. Some deploy dashboards, some activate their data using machine learning in their campaigns. Let's talk about what you would like your analytics to do for you. Please reach out today via the podcast feedback channels or connect with me, Hey Glenn S, 2 N's on Glenn, on either Twitter or Instagram. Or search up marketing analytics people on LinkedIn. I'm usually the first Glenn that pops up. Okay, let's get back to the show. So we've mentioned already that frameworks exist. You have a particular framework for how to do this. Can you tell us about it?
Yeah, so it goes back to that notion of helping companies where they are today, which is what's going on. And even though there's, of course, today all the talk with artificial intelligence and machine learning, and those activities are going on, the fact remains that a lot of work is going on in the organizations. They just don't even have the basics down still. And so applying this notion of story, creating a story, and what does that mean to that world of people, right? Who are trying to help understand what is going on. And maybe even you can incorporate things that are coming out of machine learning into that. It doesn't mean it just has to be looking backwards, right? You can combine those pieces. So it's not exclusive of that by any means. But the idea starts with, and the framework is called design to act. And right, the idea in there is that act part, right? You want somebody ultimately to move towards something. And by the way, there's a myth I'll bust. I think it's kind of unspoken that, you know, in the world of making dashboards, you can never make enough dashboards to really figure out what action you want to take. Sometimes it may happen, but ultimately, really, these are useful for identifying opportunities, things to investigate further. And really, you have to go back into the data and figure out, why did that happen? What's going on there? And then figure out
Okay.
how you may course correct, or how you may take advantage of something that looks like it's happening but you didn't expect, right? Some kind of unexpected opportunity. And that's not you're not going to get that out of the dashboards, and the people think that. And it,
No eureka moment?
it well, the eureka can be, wow, I didn't expect that, right? Or
Yeah, but what you're saying is it's what happens next that's the important
yeah.
thing.
And a lot of there's just this thought that it's going to solve everything, right? And it's unfortunate because a lot of people think that, and they're not setting themselves up for all the other work that needs to get done necessarily.
So I need to square this, or maybe help people see that this isn't an out bashing of the technology. You and I both use data visualization tools. Um, I have been, using Looker Studio for quite some time. I know that Tableau is a tool that you're very familiar with. So it's not that you're saying we shouldn't be building dashboards in those. They are, after all, among other things, dashboard building tools. You're saying be measured in what you expect, and have a plan for why you're using the tool to do that.
Yeah, you can build the story with those any of those. I look at any of these applications as if they are Microsoft Word. They are the tool to do my writing. But I have to know what I want to write about, which is not just throwing data on the screen. So they're absolutely necessary, and they all have their unique properties of how they may fit for a particular company, how they want to use them. And some companies use multiple of these tools, but part of the framework that I also help of this design to act is making the awareness that visualization is a language, is one of the first things that we get into. And what I mean is, people think data visualization is making charts or dashboards or whatever. But visualization is really how the other side of it is how people are interpreting, how your brain processes that. And they're just like in written and spoken languages, there's rules about how that works. And when you understand the rules of the language better, you can write better. And in fact, sometimes, I said stay out of the software, but sometimes even in the software, you can write poorly, and it will allow you to write poorly, but you think it's okay because it lets you do it, right? Technically, it allows it, doesn't mean it's necessarily a good thing. Just like I can write poorly in Microsoft Word.
Right.
It tries to help me, right? It tries to make suggestions, but I don't have to accept them.
What's an example of a common thing that you think we miss? in terms of not presenting visual information the way that the recipient's mind will process. Can you cite one or two ways that we just don't, like, we've done all the work up until that point, and then it just stumbles near the finish line because we haven't presented it right?
Yeah, I mean I'd say the most egregious kind of thing is where people just want to layer all of the available components together. And so they just throw all of these pieces into a chart and it becomes one, visually difficult to look at, and also visually difficult to use to analyze. And they may or may not know that's a good or bad thing. They may understand it, or they might even explain it, but just because you have some explanations doesn't mean it's going to be usable. So and they don't, and if you know the language, then you could say, well, how do I rewrite that? There's techniques to take something and break it apart, just like if you were editing writing and say, I want to simplify these run-on sentences, right? And you can do that with visuals. You could take a visual and say, this is just too complex. How do I break it down into its parts? How do I know how it was composed of different piece visual pieces? And then how do I maybe simplify my writing? Uh, so that's making it simpler, or knowing how to start. So the flip side of that is, and I think you mentioned this right in the beginning, that I might have, you know, options I'm drawn to that show me different charts I can make and things like that. Uh, people call them chart pickers, chart choosers, things like that, which are great. They can really speed up your work, make it simpler. What happens though is that people limit themselves to that being the typical universe that they work in. And here's where the rub is. So when you know the idea that you want to communicate, let's go back to that idea. When you understand that, then what you want to do is create the best way to visually represent that idea. When you understand visualization as a language, you understand the building blocks better, and you can then create visuals. You can come up with ideas for visuals that are not standard in the software.
And I'm just going to hold you right there. The perfect point. I want listeners to catch that Lee hasn't said to take away information um, because the chart type that is in front of you doesn't have a use for it or can't need it. The I think the elegant thing that one can do here is find the visual that will convey the information that you have to share, no more and no less, but that the right type of visual can exist out there. Listeners can't see this, but behind Lee, he's got a couple of books, and one of them is Edward Tuft's Visual Display of Quantitative Information. And if you haven't ever had a chance to browse through that or even just pull up an image search of some of the things in there, I've always found that to be a brain expanding uh, exploration of, oh, I thought I knew all the types of charts you could show. Nope, not even close.
Yeah.
There are some out there, and one may be exactly right. Just don't fall into the rut of, okay, I'm displaying a stock, I have to use a high-low close, or I'm displaying marketing results, I have to use a time series line chart. Go further.
Yeah, and it's back to the why, and the point that you're trying to make. You always have to go back to that. So I have a little catchphrase that I use for that notion, which is intent before content.
Yep.
So if I don't understand what point I'm trying to make, I can't create the best way to visually represent that. And
So, Lee, if we've gotten to the point where we can actually talk, maybe face to face or maybe uh, virtually with the person that we're presenting the information, are there any other things that you always find yourself saying to people at that stage so that they can just make the most of the in real time, the synchronous explanation? Um, we all know that you can communicate far more information than one just sees on a screen by using voice, using the way that we act, all of those non-verbal clues. Anything you can tell us there?
I think when you're, well, first we're in such a remote world. Uh, you have to think about if you're telling some kind of story, and the stories again can come in different modes, right? If I'm walking you through a story personally, or if I'm just expecting you to read the story on your own, there's kind of different tacks to that. One of the things that I coach people on about how to present. So typically, if you were to go into a meeting, and let's say you have a set of dashboards that you've built as a story, and you've done a great job at that. Even a lot of people talk about it from the perspective of, I'm going to click here and I'm going to click there and look at this chart, and they get into the more the technical side of it, and they don't frame it as a story. So they may have written it as a story, but then they fall back into this mode of just clicking around.
Yep.
So they don't. And again, it's it's a skill thing. This is not something we are born with. Most of some people might be better at it innately, but you can't just expect people to know how to do it. And I think that's ultimately the biggest challenge here is, how do you how do you get an organization to be able to do this? If the organizations that go back to, we want to be data driven, however they want to phrase it, how do you actually enable that is a challenge that many are still facing. They may have pockets of people who are getting better at it, but they're not scaling that
Yeah.
up.
And how it's distributed, and I suppose this is our last question. We've got two parties here. We've got the analyst who's getting it ready. We've got the decision maker who needs to absorb it and, to use your word, act on it. And we can't suppose that the literacy is distributed evenly. We may not even be able to suppose that if the person has used the principles that you describe and delivered it faithfully, maybe even compellingly, we still don't know whether or not the other party can act. I'm just wondering if you can maybe leave our listeners with some advice on how to deal with the fact that they're not in control of all of that, and that they're really just working on a best efforts basis. Or do you think that they really can help get an act realized if they're doing these things?
If they're Look, they have an advantage. They're inside the business for the most part, right? It's not like I'm coming to pitch a VC
Right.
on an
That's even
idea,
harder.
right? You're in the business. So you you all should have a common goal, and assuming that what I'm telling you aligns with your goals, right? that's goes back to what we said in the beginning of it's what are you trying to do? What does that person care about? So if I'm going to some executive and I'm doing this presentation and I tell them something that's like they don't really care about it, if it's not one of the top 5 things that concerns them in the business and I'm showing up, they're going to think it's a waste of time. So it's that having that alignment all the way through, which again gets lost because we're so focused on the data versus caring about that and and freight and even just matching it to their language as well, right? There's a lot of challenge. It's really challenging. It's a there's so much opportunity, but there's a lot that has to be done, right? Because the executive wants to hear it in their words, not your words, as well. And so the skill level, I mean, we're talking about some much more serious kinds of things here at this point for the business, right? Versus kind of the operational stuff, which is still important. Uh, there's only so much you can do. I hate to say it that way, right? Like anything. Uh, at that point, right? it- when you're making a recommendation, you're usually coming in with a set of assumptions about why something is happening or why you reach a certain conclusion. And I think in reality, what happens is those things get challenged. That's really where things go, right? And so it's a matter of uh, res- how do you talk about those assumptions? Does it make your result meaningless, or is it trying to go back and rework those assumptions? I think that's where people may also need to be
Hmm.
clearer is not just explaining the facts, but that's part of the story too, potentially, is how do you help them understand how you got there versus just here's what we found,
Right.
right?
Well, or if you're
So
going to
it's
model something, you've got to make assumptions. So you might as well just get them out there and let let it hang in the air. Let them think, okay, well, are those close to the assumptions I would make? Probably. Okay, continue, right? Because as you say, they're going to challenge you if you don't say them. So you might as well uh, go there too. But yeah, if you've properly constructed it, would it be fair to say that you at least go from maybe where we began with, just chucking facts left, right, and center, which I think has a minimal chance of getting a decision maker to do something. Uh, Done this way, at least you've got the greatest chance of doing them. And each of your competitors are organizations which themselves have this same restriction. So it's really a matter of which one is doing best relative to the rest.
the the I guess the backing up a step. It's not necessarily answering your question about what do you do at the end, but it's a preparation step. So one of the ideas is you've laid out your ideas, right? Let's say you have everything, and then you have to go back through and figure out where there's fear, uncertainty, and doubt. So, because usually you're putting your story, even if you're putting it in the framework of what they care about and you've done all that, uh, what you want to do is challenge yourself as much as you can, uh, because we don't do that enough. I think we get very uh, assured of what we've figured out because we've thought about it a lot and we think
Hmm.
it's
Yeah.
bulletproof and we think we did the analysis and it all fits together and that may all be true, but then you have to step back, right? It's kind of like on Shark Tank, right? It's kind of, they're always fearful, right? Or they doubt, like, I don't believe you, or uh you know, there's just a lot of
Yeah.
uncertainty in what you're
Or
saying.
in that very
Or
example, it's okay, you, Mr. or Mrs. Presenter, think that you should take my money. I'm the one who has the money. I made the money. I have to think about what happens to that money once I hand it over. You are not me. You do not wear, you don't walk in my shoes. And so I think that's an excellent way to portray how, because right as we do that, we will see some of those things that could have been foreseen by the time we present, and we should stop there and get them down and see whether or not what we're presenting incorporates them.
yeah, and even though I said before, it's not like it's not going to a VC, and it's not that extreme, because again, it's inside your business. It does have that notion. Actually, sometimes I tell people to think about it like you're preparing to ask for $1 million, or some whatever the number is, right? Prepare that way. Doesn't mean you're asking for $1 million, but prepare as if you were. Not just, right, because maybe you're only asking for 100,000, but that 100,000 is very meaningful for your project.
And just to carry that thought one step further, um, it's kind of comedic knowing that so many companies that are now, large Silicon Valley entities, tech firms, they have now put up online their early investor decks, which were for what, compared to the size they are now, were for a small amount of money. But I'm sure at the time they were, you know, right at
Hmm.
the end, of what their bank account could take, and they needed it. It was super important. And the thing that I always look at and notice about those is how simple and small. I mean, they're like 10 slides. They're not big. It's more about what is left there as it's delivered. I'm sure there was a ton that was brought together to prepare, but most of it got stripped away or did not lend itself to the final culmination. And we need to kind of think of that too. We can probably do ourselves a favor by looking at what they've done and copying that same minimalist approach. Lee, you've got several ways that people can follow this line of thinking and reach out to you and get your help with what they're doing. Can you tell them how they might do that?
Sure. I think the best way is just follow me on LinkedIn is great. I'm writing there pretty often, several times a week. So just these little kind of practical thought snippets of, hey, this is what's going on. Here's some things you can do to start improving. I'm a big proponent of giving people some real practical steps versus theoretical shoulds, because people don't know how to take the should and turn it into something that they can act on. So I like that. Uh, my website is decisionviz.com. And on there's descriptions of the workshops uh, that I run. There's also I have a blog post, of course, for longer form articles. But also, if people want to reach out to me, they can on LinkedIn. I have some free training sessions that I do. They're great for companies that have developed internal user groups, or they have a center of excellence that focuses on analysts, or they've formed teams of data champions, who are people that they're trying to promote to kind of be the leads in the organization. And I do these sessions, they're the same way, is that it's meant to give people some thought-provoking ideas about the way they're doing the work today, and some very specific ways that they can change that behavior. And so it's all about small steps. It's, hey, you're doing this today, change this. You don't have to worry about fixing everything at once. Small steps can really make a big difference in the way that we do our work. So again, meant to be super practical, but also meant to push their thinking a little bit too, so that they get away from kind of the world that we live in day to day. I think that's what people need, a little bit of shaking up.
Awesome. Thanks for coming on today and helping marketers and analysts see ways that they can do their jobs even better.
Thanks for listening. Follow the show on Twitter @Funnel Reboot. If you like what you have heard today, please consider leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts.